Hello and welcome to another episode of The Defenders on Sansad TV. On this episode, we are going to look at a subject which is going to be increasingly become more and more important and is going to draw in India's attention and its resources more and more so. And this is the Chinese footprint in the Indian Ocean region, with China now having, in sheer numbers, the largest navy, certainly in the Indian Ocean region and possibly in the world, and the implications for India, the Quad countries, and more specifically the United States, which is garnering its resources to challenge the Chinese presence there despite the US preoccupation with the conflict in Ukraine. And we have two suitably informed experts with us. We have Vice Admiral Satish Soni, former C&C of the Southern Naval Command of India and the Eastern Naval Command. Both of them have a very important role to play in the Indo-Pacific region and the Quad and India's maritime interests beyond the coastal areas. And we have the very well-known and possibly the top expert in India on nuclear issues, Professor Bharat Karnad of the Center for Policy Research. Professor Karnad is now a Professor Emeritus there, but he continues to write extensively in various platforms, and whenever I get half a chance, I draw him into my TV shows. So I'll start with you, Professor Karnad, sir. Now, the most recent announcement that the AUKUS arrangement, that is the Australia, UK and US arrangement for making nuclear submarines in Australia, in Perth, I believe, is something which people believe has given a new shot in the arm to the Indo-Pacific security umbrella that America wants to continue to reinforce, considering the fact that China is obviously a big threat. China has expressed concerns about this nuclear program and the fact that these submarines would probably take several years to become fully effective. So what is it that is worrying the Chinese? Is it the intent or is it the capability?
No, I think they're worried about what's going to happen, say, 10 or 15 years from now,
right,
when AUKUS is able to field these submarines under Australian command and crewed by Australians, perhaps together with American and Royal Navy crews. The question, I think, is whether or not the teeth that these submarines are supposed to be for AUKUS will actually be sharp enough to deter the Chinese. Because as the AUKUS powers themselves concede, the Chinese are building, their rate of building submarines is much higher. Nuclear powered submarines is much higher than that of both Britain and the US together. So that's that's a point of worry, I think, for the AUKUS.
Yeah, in fact, I was reading somewhere that, China's ability to churn out naval vessels, submarine ships, frigates, everything, is quite phenomenal. I mean, they've got something like 11 shipyards, and a single shipyard itself is able to churn out more than, minus the United States, most other maritime countries put together. So there is one aspect, sir. The other aspect is that, is there an interim measure in place between now and when these submarines become fully operational from the Australian coastline?
First of all, the Chinese navies, their building capabilities. Now there are 340 ships, submarine navy,
yes,
the largest in numbers, though technologically and the US Navy would any day be much better. But that is the rate at which they are growing. 10 to 15 ships and submarines they build in a year. In the last 10 years, they have commissioned built 148 of these submarines. As a comparison, the Indian Navy probably has, in the same period, built about 30, 35 or somewhere there. And we commissioned 2 to 3 ships or submarines in a year. So they are certainly going places. Their new ships are bigger in size. They are better. They have got the third aircraft carrier, Fujian, which is going to be commissioned in a short while from now. They have operationalized their second carrier. So certainly as a Navy, they are progressing. And they are certainly worrying the US and the Quad and India in particular with their presence in the Indian Ocean region. Now what the AUKUS, as you were discussing, aims to do, just 2 days back it has been announced. This earlier when the deal was announced, we were a little apprehensive as naval personnel that it will take 15 to 20 years before Australia could actually field these submarines in opposition to the increasing presence of the PLA Navy. But what has been announced in the last 2 days is a 3 or 4 point strategy. Right in the beginning, they are going to have some of the US and the RN personnel embedded in the Australian Navy. Then they are going to have the US and the Astute and the Virginia class submarines visiting their ports so that the Australian personnel can be exposed to nuclear submarineering and learn from them. And then 2030 onward, they are going to sell 3 Virginia class nuclear submarines to the Australian Navy at an enormous cost, of course. And then the AUKUS submarine, which is classified as AUKUS, but what design it is, whether it is Astute or is Virginia, is not very clear as yet. So that submarine will start coming in much later. But you can see that within the next few years, you will have an increased presence on nuclear submarines on the west coast of Australia. And that means a lot, whether it is for us in the Indian Ocean or the security of the Indian Ocean, and also as an opposition to the increasing Chinese presence, which we expect will increase, in the Indian Ocean region.
Okay, so that's quite comprehensive. And I just want to go back to Professor Karnad to say 2 things. One is that the US Navy Secretary has admitted that the US cannot match China in terms of fleet numbers because of the huge rise in numbers. And as the Admiral brought out, the Chinese are churning out ships and submarines at a phenomenal pace. But there is also the fact that the heft that the US maritime power still has and can bring to bear is basically based on 3 things. The tonnage of ships, the firepower that they bring to bear, especially the missile power that the US ships still have, and finally, of course, the US still has very well managed and operable aircraft carrier groups. So what I need to understand from you, that nuclear submarines have an important role to play, longer time under the water, and the capability of firing nuclear warheads from their positions wherever they are. But what is it that would worry a country like China about America's maritime capabilities interfering with their geostrategic designs? Because China also has a lot of submarine, and they're also gifting Pakistan submarines by the year, if not by the day. So they have submarine power, and it's not that China is going to be caught on the back foot there. So where does all this US maritime power fit in as a counter to China's designs in Asia Pacific?
But just before I get to your issue, the fact is I think we shouldn't overstate or exaggerate the Chinese naval capability. They may have aircraft carriers that the Admiral mentioned, but they have still to learn to integrate it into fleet action, fleet operations, and that will take them some time. It took us, Vikrant was inducted, as you were aware, in 1961. It took us until 15 years on for us to be completely or reasonably effective with our carrier-borne fleet operations. So it'll take China time to do that. And they're trying to cut their way to it by, for instance, getting the British pilots to train their aircraft carrier pilots, etc., both in tactics and in how to take off and land effectively, etc. So they are trying to take these shortcuts. So that said, I think what the Chinese ought to be prepared, you cannot be conclusive about these things, as to what they really ought to be worried about is the possibility that so many countries arrayed and their forces arrayed against the Chinese Navy would perhaps potentially, not just perhaps, would potentially begin throttling the lines of communications the Chinese have. Because most of the trade has to pass either through the Gulf, the energy trade has to come from the Gulf, and the onward traffic in terms of trade to the Americas, North and Central and South, has to negotiate the Indo-Pacific. So if all these countries on the periphery and as littoral states begin cooperating and collaborating in trying to hedge Chinese options, it'll become very difficult for them despite having large numbers. And by the way, most of the very large numbers are constituted of very old ships or still old ships. They're not all very new and so on. And their submarines are not all that silent, as the Admiral will bear me out. So there are these deficiencies, which I'm sure the Chinese will correct over time. But right now, they have these problems. And in the foreseeable future, this is the kind of, shall we say, a scene they'll be confronted with, where so many competent navies will be arrayed against them and will try and hedge their options and try to ring fence them. The worst that the Chinese that could happen to the Chinese Navy would be for all these fleets to cooperate and collaborate to literally, prevent
Stifle
the Chinese from going out of the harbors, out of Sanya, their main naval base in the region. So, this is the sort of thing they have to worry about.
That's actually a very interesting approach you have brought out, because as a country that has offensive intent, they need to have an open seas and free playing area to be able to show their flag, as it were, and not be on the defensive. Defensive is an option, I think, still better retained by us. And I'm coming to you, Admiral Sir. The current Naval Chief, Admiral Hari Kumar, has made one or two important remarks. One is that we are the largest resident navy in the region, and therefore we have to ensure that there is peace and stability in the oceans and the global commons. And then further on, he's gone on to say there are Chinese naval ships operating and Chinese warship, research vessels, fishing boats, etc. in large numbers, but prosperity at sea is dependent upon peace and tranquility. This is something we've always sworn by, but increasingly Chinese are happy to abandon the notion of peace and tranquility. So what is going to be increasingly our approach? Because we can't match them in shipbuilding numbers. But where we can match them is what Professor Karnad brought out in terms of our response to securing the lines of trade, communication, global commons, and having a suitably, I would say, an offensive defense posture as against a defensive defense posture.
You see, Chinese have learned from maritime history. They want to rival the US now. They want to become a world power, and they know that becoming a maritime power is a prerequisite. They laid for them certain aims. Initially, they wanted to dominate the first island chain, and then the second island chain, and then go beyond it. And that's where we come in. In 2008, for the first time, we saw them come with, just a 3-ship flotilla, ostensibly to do anti-piracy patrolling in the Gulf of Aden. They stayed on. And now we have about, as the chief of the naval staff you are quoting has said, that now we have 8 to 10 ships, intelligence ships, survey vessels. They are always in the Indian Ocean region. They have legitimate interests, as they say. There is economic interdependence with whether it is the Gulf or it's Africa. So their interests lie in the Indian Ocean, and we cannot wish them away. They are here to stay, certainly. They've got a base in Djibouti. They've got interest in Hambantota. They have got interest in, port interests in Myanmar, in Bangladesh.
And Gwadar.
And Gwadar, of course, is going to be, is a given, is going to be a naval base. So what does India do, as you said? I think we are already doing a lot. We should first secure our immediate neighborhood. And that is what we do. We have very active cooperation with Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles. We train their crews. We've given them all the help that they want, whether it is in terms of ships or refit of those ships or surveillance of their EEZs or hydrographic surveys. So that is, I think, our mainstay. That would be the most effective response. If these countries know that India, as we say, we want to be the preferred security partner, and if India is the first responder, to any crisis, whether it is floods or it is HADR or whether it is vaccines or anything, if they know that we can fulfill these tasks, then they will not go the China way. And these countries are important. They are not small. They are big countries, if you ask me, because they have got big EEZs. Mauritius, for example, maybe a small island, 20 by 30 or 30 by 40 nautical miles, but it has a EEZ which is probably in the first 30 in the world. So it's important. And for these countries, what is important is that they want to harness the dividends of blue economy. They want to exploit their EEZs for the economic benefit. And that is where we come in. If we can facilitate those, then they will stay with us.
Okay. Professor Karnad, we have strategic partnerships with two countries that are big players, but we often don't talk about them in the Indian Ocean context. One is France. It has a large presence in the Indian Ocean region. And of course, the other is Japan, which is increasingly becoming well tied in with the Indian security concerns or narrative, call it what should be. Now, the US is using particularly Japan and some of the string of islands in that area to put pressure on China, because the Chinese have stupidly done what Hitler did in World War II. They're opening up in too many fronts. And the US is messaging the Chinese through Japan, which, for example, their US base in Okinawa, they are now putting the entire team there of 18,000 US personnel on a state of high alert and aggressive posturing, which hasn't been the case for years. Japan has also adopted a much more militaristic posture after the late President Abe's approach to abandon their self-defense approach, as it were. So, what do you see the Chinese responding with? Because the China's friend in that region is the other temperamental nuclear weapon state, that's North Korea. And nuclear weapons at the end of the day, unlikely to be used, but they're a big deterrent and they convey very strong messaging. So, do you feel that this entire naval buildup that is being put across on China's eastern front will peter off if China becomes as aggressive as North Korea in nuclear messaging?
Look, an aggressive China will naturally want to have an expansive presence in the waters of the world. It's not just the Indo-Pacific or Indian Ocean and so on. They want to have their presence all over. That said, I think, and because they mean to be the dominant power by 1949, the centenary celebrations of their evolution, they are now speeding up these kinds of actions on their parts and policies that will realize this sort of objective. Now, whether they can do it in the face of opposition from littoral countries and countries of Asia, I'm not so sure. It's one thing that Xi Jinping and his cohort and the Communist Party Presidium or whatever it is, Politburo, may wish to do something or intend to do something. It's quite another thing to actually realize it in the waters and in the field, as it were. So that's not going to happen, especially because I think everybody is now alerted to China's expansionist and very aggressive mien, and they mean therefore to strike, I think, opportunistic alliances and partnerships, just so they can ward off Chinese attentions, negative attentions, and that's true of the smaller states. And they're all playing it very cannily. While none of the, look at the ASEAN states, they do not want to come out front and say that they want to partner the Indo-Pacific, AUKUS, or the Mod Quad or Quadrilateral. But they're quite happy to do it without making a big hullabaloo about it, right?
So behind somebody's back,
right.
as it were.
I mean,
now,
that's true of
the same
Vietnam
applies
and
to
everybody
Japan.
else.
Japan was for until now reluctant to point its fingers at China, despite all the threats they face. But now the Japanese have come out very clearly to say that not only are we going to arm ourselves with Tomahawk missiles, not only are we going to refurbish our military posturing, but also their current Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, has gone on to say in a national security strategy that China, North Korea and Russia are the priority areas for Japanese security, and identifying China as the topmost security threat, which is something that Japan didn't do for a long time. So, do you feel that the entire focus of attention of the Quad, and I will come back to you, sir, I'll ask you this question, the entire focus of attention of the Quad is going to be more towards the Pacific Ocean and less towards the Indian Ocean? Because if China is restricted there, as Professor Karnad brought out, that you restrict their movement and don't let them step out of their comfort zone, then what are they going to come and do? We already have a reasonably strong maritime presence here. We will keep beefing up our presence and China will keep getting hemmed in out there. So the situation is going to be fairly manageable. Or am I wrong?
No, you see, the Quad essentially is focusing on a number of things, whether it is technology or it is, cooperation on vaccines, and they have been somewhat hesitant to openly come out and Quad to say that, we are a maritime security grouping.
Yes, you're right.
During the Raisina dialogues, there were the first announcements that there is a maritime security subgroup which is going to be meeting, or some discussions on maritime security are going to be held in Washington. Last meeting, they had said that we are going to be sharing MDA, which is Maritime Domain Awareness. Now, the moment you say that we are going to be sharing maritime domain awareness, it willy-nilly means that there is some angle to addressing maritime security also. So, Quad is, while they may not say it, but certainly they are looking at maritime security issues. Whether how much they go into it, we have a concurrent, totally a separate arrangement in the Malabar series of exercises, which is not related to Quad, but all the Quad members are exercising now. And as we speak, they are going to be exercising in Australia during the next exercise. So, they are, where does it go from there? There are hawks who say that yes, Quad must come out and openly say that it is going to be somewhat, if not an alliance, a semi-alliance in the maritime sphere. If that happens, we could certainly see a lot more proactive stance from these four countries.
Okay. Professor Karnad, here's another question which I don't seem to find answers in my mind in that. We have a very strong relationship with Russia, including in the maritime area. They're the only country that have leased us nuclear submarines. And I believe more could come from them, and leasing is a euphemism for allowing us to use it in every possibility. Now, Russia and China have now become more or less the new Cold War allies against the West. Now, we don't have that honky-dory relationship with China as we probably have with Russia. What happens in the event of a conflict, in the event of tensions? Will we be put under restrictions by Russia not to use their leased weapons platform, especially the nuclear submarine, against China? Because it has been the case in the past that even Russia or the Americans, for example, with the F-16s with Pakistan, and Russia with the equipment to us, like BrahMos missile, they don't give us permission very easily to export those missiles unless it is to a country that doesn't threaten Russian interests. So where do you see the Russian dimension coming into this whole equation, particularly with reference to nuclear vessels?
It's very unlikely that Russia is going to restrict Indian use of their armaments that they're given to us, either in outright sale or by way of lease and so on. That's because I think you shouldn't begin to underestimate the kind of differences, very basic and fundamental differences that exist in terms of clashing interests between Russia and China. And the Russians haven't forgotten that. They keep reminding you when you talk, I mean, this is subsurface understanding that India and Russia have and have always had ever since the Ussuri clashes in 1979.
Yes.
Look, we have very basic differences with China. The Russians are very worried about the demographic creep and occupation and eventual annexation by the Chinese of Siberia, which is underpopulated, underhabited, and therefore the Russians very, very strongly fear that the Eastern Pacific regions and provinces would be threatened by China, are threatened by China, and China poses an existential threat to the Asian portion of Russia.
Interesting.
And
very
therefore,
interesting.
they're not going to be...
That's a very, very interesting finding, which quite frankly I wasn't aware of. Admiral sir, last question to you. Require a relatively shorter answer due to time constraint. France has a presence in the Indian Ocean region. France also makes nuclear submarines. France supplies us technology in military hardware. So if there is an AUKUS in Australia, why can't there be an Indo-France arrangement for a nuclear submarine?
Well, that's what is being talked about.
Okay.
I think that's what people are writing, that the French Barracuda class, should be the way to go for the Indian Navy in acquiring SSNs. The trouble is that nuclear propulsion or nuclear technology is normally not shared, but AUKUS has made a beginning. With the technology being exported to Australia, why not to India also? If the US certainly won't do it because they have got very strong bureaucracy, surely they can nudge France into doing the same. So I strongly recommend that.
Okay. So on those interesting insights, we would need to end the show. Thank you to both of you for your wisdom, and thanks for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.